Good afternoon. I think we have everyone on board now. I hope so. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jackie Wells, and among other things, I'm an associate of ILC. And many thanks for joining us for the launch of this report, which is called Slipping Through the Cracks, Retirement Income Prospects for Generation X. And this is hosted by ILC and has been generously supported by Phoenix Group. This new report looks at the retirement income prospects for Generation X and some of the barriers for this group in saving for retirement and how policymakers can respond in the short to medium term to support this generation who are set to retire over the next 10 to 25 years. We'll be hearing from an expert panel of speakers that will be responding to the report's findings. And then we want to hear your views in the Q&A session at the end. And we have plenty of time for questions then. Before we get started, the usual few housekeeping points to go through. Internet issues may affect sound and video, so please do bear with us if this happens. At the bottom of your screen, you will see the chat function to communicate with panelists and other delegates, as well as the Q&A feature. And it's the Q&A feature that we'd like you to use for any specific questions you have about the report and questions for panelists. If you're having any issues with audio or video through the webinar, try to connect with an Ethernet cable or through the hotspot on your phone. I'm sure you're all used to doing these things now. And if you get disconnected, then please join through the same link that you joined initially. And just to confirm, this webinar is being recorded and published for public access on our website and is live now and will be available through the ILC UK YouTube channel. So again, as we go through, submit your questions to our speakers using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and join the conversation if you can on Twitter using @ILCUK and #GenerationX. So that's by way of introduction. We now have our first speaker, who is Andy Curran. Andy joined Phoenix Group in July 2020 as CEO to lead the UK and European savings and retirement business. Andy's had over 30 years of experience in the life and pension sector, most recently before Phoenix as MD Corporate with Aviva. And Phoenix is a leader in the workplace market and is keen to help customers throughout their journey to and through retirement. So they're ideally placed to support this piece of work. So Andy, if I could just hand over to you to introduce this piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the virtual launch of the International Longevity Centre's latest research report, Slipping Between the Cracks, Retirement Income Prospects for Generation X, and sponsored by the Phoenix Group. Thank you very much for joining us at this launch event. As Jackie says, I'm Andy Curran, CEO of Savings and Retirement at the Phoenix Group. And I am pleased to say that of all the people speaking on this afternoon's VC, my task is perhaps the most straightforward. I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining why Phoenix has sponsored this research, along with why we believe it is significant. Sophia from the ILC will talk through the report's findings, and then members of the panel will debate and reflect on the content. This will be followed by a live Q&A session, which I will also be joining. I will be kept in check by our chair for today, Jackie, who we've just heard from. So why has Phoenix sponsored the research? Phoenix Group is the largest long-term savings and retirement business in the UK, which means that we're entrusted with the long-term savings of approximately 14 million customers. This is both a huge privilege and a great responsibility. It is our duty to look after these savings and help people to enjoy a secure and sustainable future. This goes to the core of why we exist as an organisation. At a time when there is, rightly, a strong focus on environmental, social and government considerations, our role in helping people to save for the long term is the very essence of our social purpose as a business. The issues facing Generation X have been a rising concern for us. We know from our own data that many in this generation are not saving enough for their futures. We recently worked with the Pensions Policy Institute on the publication of Generation Vexed, Solving the Retirement Puzzle. And I look forward to hearing from Chris Curry of the PPI on this research in today's panel discussion. In the report today, we have used the important PPI work to really drill down into the personal challenges this generation are facing. And unfortunately, the findings present a worrying picture. Without stealing any of Sophia's thunder before she presents the main findings, it's clear the report paints a bleak picture of the retirement prospects for the Generation Xers. The COVID-19 pandemic has also clearly hit the ability of the Generation Xers to save. We want to work together to find interventions and policies that can help. Far too many from this generation are ill-prepared for later life, which means that urgent action should be taken to support savings and help people to work longer. Many feel an overwhelming pessimism about their ability to retire, while others are oblivious to a future that awaits them. We must act to help this generation get to the future they deserve. To do that, I believe we need to focus on three key areas: adequacy, engagement, and action. Firstly, adequacy. Auto-enrolment has been a success. 10 million more people are now saving for their retirement, but the level of contribution is not adequate. As longevity increases, we must maximise the number of people included in auto-enrolment. To address adequacy, contribution levels must increase. This is key to long-term financial security and independence. Generation Xers have missed the many years of auto-enrolment that Generation Z can look forward to. We need to find ways to help them get an adequate level of savings for their retirement. Secondly, moving on to engagement. Engagement is not a pack of boring papers. Engagement is about communicating and helping people when they need it. We must increase the level of engagement with all consumers and do so much earlier. Positive engagement is particularly vital with Gen Xers. We know time is running out to engage. The ILC research will help us uncover how we might do this. Also, the pension dashboard is a critical component in this engagement. Ultimately, we want to help people make good choices when it comes to saving for their retirement. 3/4 of savers are unwilling to pay for financial advice, so while seeing an IFA can be a very valuable approach, it is not right for all. The advice gap leaves out many people without the information they need to understand their retirement prospects. Engagement is key to changing this. We have an opportunity to change things for the better. Current EU regulations prevent us from offering our customers simple, sensible advice on their options. The regulators can change this and remove this barrier to engagement. I believe this must happen if we're able to help people have the secure retirement that everyone deserves. Let's take the opportunity that leaving the EU gives us. Let's amend the regulations so we can help people. That is what they deserve. Now, quickly turning to action. None of us can solve the Generation X challenge on our own. The report shows how important it is for the government, industry, and policymakers to work together. We need to take urgent action to help improve the future of Generation X. This is the generation that entered into the job market too late to benefit from final salary pensions, yet too early to benefit from schemes such as auto-enrolment. The combination means that without swift action, many Gen Xers are expected to face very significant challenges in retirement and even potentially pensioner poverty. Policymakers, industry, and businesses need to work together to help this generation. COVID is also putting an additional strain on many people's finances, which makes this even more urgent. So my closing thoughts: what do we need to address? Adequacy, engagement, and the action that is needed before it's too late. That is the good news. It is not too late. At Phoenix, we are keen to play our part in this and hope Phoenix sponsorship of this research is a significant and useful contribution to the discussion. I would also like to say thank you to the team at ILC for their hard work in producing the rigorous research in this report, along with all the panelists speaking at today's event. If Finally, I want to thank all of you for dialing in for today's VC, for taking the time out of your busy schedules while we all balance the pressures of working from home. Thank you, and I'll now pass you all back to Jackie.
Thanks, Andy. I think you've set us up with some quite challenging policy and regulatory themes to think on there. Before we come to some of those again, and I'm sure we will return to them, I'm going to ask Sophia to take us through some of the highlights from this research. I know that Sophia's been working amazingly hard on this piece of work, and her research has been amazingly comprehensive as well. And I suspect she's now one of the country's leading experts on Gen X's. Sophia joined ILC in May 2019 as a research fellow. And since then, she's led a number of projects on the economic contribution of older people through working, spending, caring, and volunteering. She's previously worked as a policy and research officer for Ash Wales and as a social researcher for the ONS. So, Sophia, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through some of the headlines. Thank you.
Thank you for this, Jackie. So as mentioned, yes, my name's Sophia, and I'll be discussing the key findings of our research, and thank you again to Phoenix Group for making this possible. So just a bit about what we're going to cover in the presentation. We'll just cover a bit of context. We'll consider how prepared Gen Xers are and how they feel. We'll also consider what the key barriers they face to saving for retirement. We'll touch upon the impact of COVID, what Gen X's plans are around working in later life, and finally, the opportunities we have to address the challenges that Gen X's face to saving for retirement. So if we start a bit with the context, what we find is that Gen X's retirement prospects have been affected by a number of socioeconomic challenges. So firstly, they've witnessed a shifting pensions policy landscape. So that's included the decline in relatively generous defined benefit pension schemes, but also they've witnessed the introduction of automatic enrolment, although this may have been introduced too late for Gen Xers in the older and middle end of the cohort to fully benefit. They've also witnessed a number of changing economic trends. So of course, the 2008 recession. Following this, we saw a stagnation in wages. They've also witnessed a long-standing rise in insecure work, and in particular, a rise in house prices compared to earnings. And that's particularly Gen Xers in the middle and younger end of the cohort. And so what this means is they may have struggled to save for a housing deposit. They would have got on the housing ladder later, and they'll be paying off their mortgage for longer, potentially some into retirement. But Gen Xers have seen a number of positive economic trends. So interest rates have been relatively low through most of their working lives, and that will benefit those with a mortgage. And we've also seen rising employment rates, particularly for women. So they've also experienced a number of social trends. So of course, people are living longer, and Gen X's parents are living longer. And that means that will have implications. Potentially they'll have be more likely to have caring responsibilities in later life. We're also seeing that people are generally having children later. And so what we're seeing is that Gen Xers are more likely to be living with their children than baby boomers were at the same age. So really, it's a really busy period for them right now, and it will be when they hit their peak caring years. And we're also seeing that while many people are living longer, they're not necessarily spending more years in good health. And actually some of those years are spent in poor health. And this is particularly the case for younger Gen Xers. And so that will have implications for their ability to work in later life. So we've seen some of these shifts have offered opportunities, but many have hindered or could hinder Gen X's retirement prospects. And with some retiring in just over a decade, we do need to act soon. So we do have time, but we do need to act now. So if we start with how prepared is Gen X, it's important to note that this is, of course, a heterogeneous group. So around 44% have defined benefit pension savings. Not all of them will have substantial DB pension savings, but some will. And over half expect to have additional non-pension income in retirement. So that could involve other savings and investments, income from buy-to-let properties, for instance. And so many of these Gen Xers may be relatively well prepared for retirement. But that said, about 46% of Gen Xers have defined contribution pensions, and the majority of this group are significantly under-contributing. So they're saving far less than what they need to achieve both a moderate, but even a modest standard of living in retirement. We also find that just under 1 in 3 are barely saving enough to achieve a minimum standard of living. So that means they're unlikely to have financial security and also the flexibility to do many of the things they might want to do. And over half of this group expect to have no additional income in retirement other than their private pension savings and the state pension. So they could be quite financially vulnerable in later life. And I think the take-home point here is, this is a diverse generation. Some people might be okay, but others will really struggle. And I think we need to focus on the most disadvantaged. So how do Gen Xers feel in terms of preparedness for retirement? Well, what we find is that actually more think they'll be worse off than better off than their parents in retirement, but around equal proportions think they themselves will be worse off than the same or better off in later life. But among those that are more optimistic, some of these may be incorrectly so. So we find that about 1 in 5 of Gen Xers who expect to not be worse off in retirement are actually considerably undersaving. So they're barely saving enough to achieve a minimum standard of living. And we also find that 1 in 4 Gen Xers are partly relying on income sources that might not materialize when they need this income. So they're kind of relying on receiving inheritance or relying on downsizing. But we do know that most people underestimate how long they'll live, how long other people will live, and potentially also some people do underestimate how long it will take them to pay off their mortgage. And we're also seeing many more people in later life living with adult children, and so they're needing their family homes for longer than they expect. So if we now turn to the barriers to saving, what we see is that the majority of Gen Xers do want to save more, but they say they're struggling to do so, held back by a number of barriers, particularly related to affordability. So we find that 1/3 of Gen X say that a key reason that they're not saving more for retirement is that they're prioritizing paying off debts. This is mainly related to paying off the mortgage, but a few are also struggling with student loans. And we also find that about 50% say they can't afford to save more. And that's a key barrier that Gen Xers are really facing. And so when we ask this group why they can't afford to save more, they cite a number of reasons. The main one being that they feel they're not earning enough, and that might be affected by that stagnation in wages that we talked about. But also a number of other factors, so like housing costs are really key. That's particularly mortgage costs, but also rental costs. Many also saying that their ability to work is restricted because of health needs, care responsibilities, or other factors like redundancy, and others are financially supporting children. And I think the key point here really is that many are facing competing priorities, and it's the multiple priorities and financial pressures at once that are making it really difficult for some to save more. So we've talked about affordability and debt, but there are also other important barriers. And the next key one is more psychological. So about 29% of Gen Xers say they feel too overwhelmed with these competing priorities to actually think about retirement. And this is particularly high for those with caring responsibilities. And I think that was really, we really heard this in our qual research. So for instance, one Gen X woman, mentioned to us, she's thinking about paying the mortgage, trying to do the best for her kids, and her parents are starting to need care. So for her, the key barrier is just making retirement a priority. It's really difficult. And I think many are really feeling the same way. Another key barrier is insecurity. So people are struggling with insecure incomes and outgoings. And this is particularly high among the self-employed. And we know they struggle with unpredictable earnings, and that can make it really difficult to save on a regular basis. A few were also saying that they find it difficult to motivate themselves. And while only 10% say that a lack of information is a barrier to saving, other factors indicate that this is quite important. So about 39% of Gen X say they don't feel confident to plan for their retirement on their own. And the majority actually don't know what they roughly need to save to achieve an adequate income in retirement. So there are loads of different recommendations out there, and they differ slightly, but the majority of Gen Xers either think they need to be saving far less than this or just don't know, and that's really worrying. And finally, the majority of Gen Xers say they're really keen to receive in particular guidance, but also financial advice on retirement planning, but very few actually have done so. So if we now turn to the least prepared groups, what we can see, they're displayed in the first column of this table. And what we can see is that they really struggle, they're disproportionately likely to face barriers to saving. And they mainly relate to affordability and insecurity. So private renters, for instance, say they're struggling with high rental costs, and we know that paying for rent is generally higher than paying for a mortgage across the country. So that's quite unsurprising. And we also find that about 20% of younger Gen X private renters say they can't afford to save more because they're saving for a home. So the housing dream isn't lost among that particular group. Another key issue affecting many of these disadvantaged groups is that they say that that poor health actually limits their ability to work. And interestingly, what we find is that those who have a health condition or a disability, but that doesn't impact on their ability to work, are not particularly unprepared for retirement, but it's those whose health limits their ability to work that are really disadvantaged. I think there's a lot of scope for employers to help everyone that is able to be able to work where possible. I think that will really affect their retirement prospects. We're also finding that those with adult care responsibilities are particularly disadvantaged, and that's primarily because of the impact on caring responsibilities on their employment. So that's a really key driver for this. Again, we're seeing that the self-employed and groups that are more likely to have self-employed workers are really struggling with insecure earnings. And finally, we're seeing that the self-employed and those who are earning below the automatic enrolment threshold are particularly likely to have no pension savings at all. And that might be because these groups aren't auto-enrolled, and so they may really struggle to overcome the well-known inertia to saving, where we know that many people are not generally proactive about saving. So that's a lot of research has documented that phenomenon. So if we now turn to the impact of COVID, what we can see is that many people are already struggling to save, but COVID has only made things harder. So about 24% of Gen X have seen their employment patterns negatively affected by COVID, and 20% are either spending their retirement savings or are saving less. But of concern, this has hit some of the most disadvantaged groups the hardest. So that includes the self-employed, part-time workers, or those on low incomes. So these groups are really struggling already, and the pandemic has made things worse. That's really concerning. But on a more positive note, we have seen that about 23% of Gen X say they now have more time to think about planning for retirement, or they are actually thinking about planning for retirement. And that's mainly because of the impact of COVID on the economy, and that's encouraged people to really start thinking about the need to plan. And so I think there's an opportunity there to increase engagement with retirement planning among Gen X. So we're seeing that many people are struggling to save for retirement, and to compensate for lower savings, we find that many Gen Xers are actually planning to rely on working past the state pension age to address this. And that's more than those that plan to save a higher share of their incomes. And this is particularly the case among those who say they can't afford to save more. So that group may be kind of pushed into having to rely on working for longer. But that said, many aren't confident they'll actually be able to work for as long as they need. And that's because they fear a number of factors getting in their way. And I think these concerns are quite justified. So previous research finds that around 1 million people from the age of 50 to 64, so before the state pension age, are actually involuntarily out of work because of a number of factors, the key one being poor health, but also involuntary redundancy, which is partly affected by age discrimination. We also know that age discrimination may explain why older workers are less likely to receive training than their younger counterparts, which will make it difficult for people to adapt to an ever-changing job market. And we also know that many individuals with adult care responsibilities leave the labour force early because they're not given the flexibility to combine both. But a key point here is that many of these factors can be mitigated with the right support from employers. So what can we do? Well, given that Gen Xers are facing a myriad of barriers, we think there needs to be a multifaceted approach. So we think the government needs to act on 3 broad pillars. So firstly, we think it needs to address the wider affordability constraints that so many face. Secondly, we need to improve the pension system by building on the success of automatic enrolment to help people to save more. And we know that so many people are overwhelmed with other priorities, even if they have the money to. We do need to tackle that inertia to saving. I think this is a way to do that. And finally, we need to increase Gen X's engagement and awareness of retirement planning. We've seen that there is scope to do this, and we can do this by making information more accessible. And so, and just to reiterate, there is an element of urgency. There is time, but we do need to act soon. So I'll now discuss a few policies, but more policies are discussed in the report in more detail as there, of course. So if we want to tackle the wider affordability constraints, we can do that through three main ways. And firstly, we need to tackle the barriers to working for longer. So that firstly can involve increasing flexible work opportunities that will particularly support those in poor health and those who have caring responsibilities. One way to do this is to make all jobs flexible by default. So unless there's a strong business case not to offer this, we think this is really important. And we've actually seen since COVID that far more jobs can be offered on a flexible basis than we previously thought. So this is a good opportunity to push for this. Secondly, we need to support workers in poor health. We've seen how important this barrier is, and we think increasing awareness and access of government access to work funds is really key. These are currently predominantly used by younger workers who have long-standing disabilities and health conditions, so we think there's scope to increase use and awareness for older workers with acquired disabilities. Thirdly, we know that the key issue in terms of tackling age discrimination is actually enforcement. And so we want to review the mechanisms for this. And one point that we think is quite important is allowing tribunals to consider cases of multiple types of discrimination, because that might strengthen the success of some age discrimination cases. And finally, we've seen the impact of COVID. And so we do think it's really important to boost skills and support unemployed workers and just generally increase training opportunities more generally. And so there are a number of policies here suggested as to how to do that. But I'll just move on in terms of time purposes. So another key point in terms of tackling the wider affordability constraints is making it easier for carers to combine their caring responsibilities with work. And one way to do this is to introduce carers leave, and so that's to give carers the flexibility they would so value. And thirdly, we need to make renting more affordable and secure. We know that renting is crowding out savings for retirement, and we also need to support first-time buyers. That would not only enable them to reduce their housing costs while saving for retirement, but also to support them whilst they actually retire. So one way to do this is to kind of build on some of the successful principles of automatic enrolment and offer all employees an opt-in tax incentivized savings vehicle through automatic enrolment to allow first-time buyers to essentially save for a housing deposit via regular automatic contributions from their pre-tax earnings. So they can receive tax relief on this. Potentially some of their employer contributions could be could go towards that pot, but they could also contribute to a pension alongside this. And I think that, you know, it's really important that we get the key balance between supporting people to build up their pension pots, but also enable them to buy a house if they want to, because both are really important for later life. So if we now turn to improving the pension system and building on the success of automatic enrolment, given so many people are financially struggling, we do think this would be more effective if targeted at moments when Gen Xers have more money to save and those that are really struggling are given some flexibility. So firstly, we can do this by introducing auto-escalation. So that essentially allows people to automatically pay more into pension when they've received a pay rise or a promotion. So we're tapping into moments when Gen Xers have more money. Secondly, we can introduce prompts or automatic mechanisms to encourage those who've paid off debts to save more into their pension. And again, we're tapping into moments when people are facing fewer financial pressures. And thirdly, we think it's really important to set out a timetable to increase current automatic enrolment contribution rate. You know, so many people are under saving. And I think it's important to know that if this doesn't happen soon, you know, many Gen Xers won't benefit in time. So that's really important. And given that some people are financially struggling, I think it is important to offer some Gen X, offer some people the option to contribute at a sub-minimum rate temporarily, just to give them that flexibility if they're financially struggling. But we should try and ensure that is as temporary as possible. And finally, we think the idea of a sidecar savings vehicle, which has been proposed by Nest, could really support individuals struggling with insecurity. And so essentially the idea is this allows people to ensure they have sufficient emergency savings while saving into a pension. And we think this could be offered to employees over and above their kind of existing pension support, so they could potentially contribute to even higher rates, but in a more flexible way if they need to. And we think this could particularly benefit disadvantaged groups like the self-employed and those earning below the automatic enrolment threshold, because we know they're really struggling with insecurity barriers. And so we recommend expanding automatic enrolment to these groups, but offering a sidecar scheme as part of that solution. And finally, if we want to make information more accessible, we need to think about what Gen Xers want. And we actually know that they're really keen for more information on how much to roughly save to achieve their retirement goals. And we know there's some really rough ballpark measures already out there. And secondly, how to keep track of multiple pension pots. And so I think the pensions dashboard will essentially deal with the latter, but we think this will be even more effective if it eventually incorporates ballpark saving levels required to achieve different living standards in retirement, because we know Gen Xers are really keen on that. Secondly, we know that many Gen Xers would like to receive guidance on retirement planning, but the reason many don't is because they're actually not aware that there are available options out there. So we think it's important to increase the awareness and uptake of existing pensions-wise guidance, but also to trial offering a service for Gen Xers that are not eligible for that service at the moment. We also note that Gen Xers are particularly keen to want to receive information on retirement planning when they move job. So I think that's a really great opportunity for employers to offer new employees information about their pension contributions and how they relate to living standards. And finally, we need to increase access to affordable advice. We know the main reason that Gen Xers don't receive advice is because they find it too expensive, or the market doesn't offer them advice if their incomes are too low. So just to summarise, as we've seen, Gen X is a diverse generation. While some may be prepared, some may be particularly disadvantaged in later life. We know that many are pessimistic about retirement, but others may be actually sleepwalking into financial hardship. We have seen that the majority do want to save more, but they're held back by a number of barriers, affordability constraints being the main one. And this is particularly the case for the most disadvantaged groups. So what do we need to do? We need a kind of multifaceted approach. Firstly, we need to address the wider affordability challenges that many face. We need to build on the success of automatic enrolment to support people to save more, but offer some flexibility to those who are really struggling. And finally, make information retirement planning more accessible. So thank you for listening. I look forward to the Q&A. I'll just hand back to Jackie. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. That's left us with lots and lots of things to think about there, and some great proposals for solutions to some of these issues. We're now going to move on to our panel responses, and we've got I think 3 or 4 panelists. I think 3 at the moment. So I'm delighted to welcome these speakers, and I'm sure they're all well placed to add to this debate about Gen Xers. Firstly, I'd like to invite Jonathan Reynolds, MP, to respond to the report. Jonathan has served as the Member of Parliament for Stalybridge and Hyde, I hope I've said that right, Stalybridge, since 2010. He was appointed to the Shadow Cabinet by Sir Keir Starmer in 2020 as Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, so well placed to respond to this. Jonathan, so if we could go over to you to respond to the report, thanks.
Jackie, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's pronounced Stalybridge. It rhymes with gravy, but don't worry, you did a pretty solid job there. And really interested in this event, was really keen to do it. A lot of things that caught my attention in the report. Hard to cover them all in 5 to 7 minutes. But first of all, I want to say I found out I was part of Generation X. I've just squeezed in there. I was born in 1980. So that was an interesting thing to clarify. The second point is I think this issue of adequacy of are people's pension savings meeting their expectations and what they need to be thinking about, I think is an enormous issue. And the way that any political system works, longer term issues tend to get shut out a little bit for the shorter term ones. And so it's absolutely the conversation we need to have. In the second reading of the Pension Schemes Bill recently in Parliament, I was teased a little bit for saying that I was fascinated by pensions policy. I think I'm probably in a sympathetic panel of people here to say that again. But for me, if I look at the the progression through the different generations of my family, my parents, my grandparents, and what we have seen, I think that is honestly a remarkable story for this country. And I think what this report identifies is that progress can't be taken for granted, and that even because of the decline of DB schemes and just the pressures on people's ability to save, it could go into significant decline. I think the framing of the report, a kind of post DB, pre-DC generation, is absolutely right to look at. I think, to be frank, the generation that's coming after it, it doesn't get much easier for them. I mean, obviously there is auto enrollment there working away, but I just look at the interest rate on student debt, and you can see, these issues are not going to become easier. So they're absolutely the right ones for us to be talking about here, and hopefully stimulating a debate for the future. I thought, as Sophia has said in her introduction, look, you can't separate out the pressures on people's ability to save from the wider economic issues, particularly around housing costs and access to housing for younger people. I think the report is also absolutely right to talk about the diversity of this cohort of people, particularly, I'd like to see some of these analyses, some of the data broken down, I think, in terms of gender and occupational sector. I think that would tell us a lot as well. But there were sort of 4 things in particular I wanted to squeeze into this brief response before we move on to the questions, Jackie. The first one was to say, I think the conversation about the state pension and the triple lock has to relate to this debate. I think a lot of the time the conversation on the triple lock in political terms is understandably framed as being about intergenerational fairness. But what a report like this shows us is the indexation of the state pension and what it will mean for people who are not today pensioners but will be in future is a really important issue. I think there's no way to avoid the fact that the British state pension is low by international standards. It's obviously a lot higher when you consider, the social wage, the fact we have a national health service, and the system overall is clearly much healthier when occupational provision is factored in. But these are significant issues. And actually, I think a lot of the time when I read coverage of the triple lock, I think there's a failure to recognise that actually if you took away the triple lock and just had a double lock, earnings or prices, you actually don't save that much money in that proposal. And if you just went to, say, a link to CPI, well, you really would be eroding the value over time. And at the same time, you'd almost certainly get the kind of political issue at some point that Gordon Brown encountered when inflation was low, and the rise in the state pension was seen to be unacceptably small, and that produced a political blowback on that situation. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second is around auto enrolment, which I think is one of the great policy success stories in this country's history. The question is always going to be how we build on that. I don't think anyone thinks the situation is adequate as it stands, and it was always the intention for us to build on this situation. I thought the rewards model proposed in the paper is really interesting. I've heard and had pitched to me similar ideas to this before. I suppose my question for the experts on the panel would be, is that sufficient? I mean, is that going to get us to where we need to get to? I think there might be a need for that to be one component, but to go further in other areas. And ideally, that would be done by partnership. Everyone quite rightly is sensitive to the state that a lot of businesses are in post when they will be in when we come out of the pandemic, which is still ongoing, and those pressures have to be factored in. But we need a long-term partnership to see those changes ideally agreed on a cross-party basis. And I think the question about tax relief and wider questions about the tax regime for self-invested pensions and things like that should be part of that conversation to try and set that longer-term framework in place. The third thing I wanted to say was, I think for this generation, they quite understandably have very high expectations of consumer access and transparency. I often compare, if I'm going to look at my ISA, for example, I can look at that on my phone. I get very clear market information, up-to-date information. I get very clear investor information for where any funds that I've got are being held. That is very different to most people's experience of their own pension provision, even if they are in an adequate position. And I think, as the report says, the dashboard has to be the fulcrum of the answer to that. I think that could be certainly the answer to the small pots issue, which I think has already come up in the Q&A, how we cope with an economy where people will be doing many more jobs than historically the system has had to cope with, and how we make sure not only that they're following their pots around, that they've got access to them, but they've got very clear information on things like fee transparency, know that they're not getting a poor deal because they're holding their pots in several small places rather than consolidating them together. I also think that that point around transparency and consumer information has to relate to things like climate change. You know, for many people in this generation and people coming after them, there is no tension between, you know, the return that they expect on their investments and their considerations they want those holdings to have for things like climate exposure. I mean, even for someone my age, there is nothing in it for me if my own pension investments produce a world which is uninhabitable for my children. There's just literally no point. It's not a long-term plan. I think actually that there's been a coming together of interests in that area, but at the minute the information people tend to receive is not sufficient. Final point, because I feel I'm already probably going over time, Jackie, is to say advice and action on scams have to be part of this as well. I have some genuinely appalling case studies that come my way as the Shadow Secretary of State for pensions. I think any fraud on a person is a shocking crime, but I think when it comes down to people's pension savings, it is literally something that will ruin your life if you're the victim of it. And of course, if you are in a position where you've fallen victim to a scam, not only will you in all likelihood lose your life savings, you'll almost certainly be pursued by HMRC for a tax charge because of the way you've withdrawn your investments and been taken advantage of. And it's appalling. And I think there are, to be honest, issues that go beyond the regulation of pensions that we need to look at. I think how financial crime is dealt with in the UK and that split of responsibilities between police forces and the FCA and the National Crime Agency has got to be part of that conversation too. And on the point of advice, absolutely, getting good advice to people at the right price is crucial. Pension-wise, very good. I think there are changes and things we discussed in the pension schemes bill when the Lord's amendments came back to the Commons that we could go further in terms of the ability of trustees to act if they think someone is being taken advantage of in cooling off periods. I also think robo-advice could play a much bigger role in financial services across the board in the UK, and not to buy specific products. I think no one would want to see that level of regulation, but I think to signpost people into the kinds of things they should be considering, to give them clear information about whether, you know, what their expectations are of their retirement and what that will have to mean for them in terms of what they're putting away. I think all of that could be part of it. The final thing I just want to say is that there's no mention in the report of the changes with the introduction of collective defined contribution schemes. You know, there are different views on this, I know, but I think from our part as the opposition, responding to the pension schemes bill, you know, there is a potential there with CDC schemes to be something not as good as DB schemes, but maybe better than DC schemes. And I think those issues of intergenerational fairness play into those conversations, and often people have strong views either side of this, but I think it's something we've got to consider as part of this conversation. So Jackie, I'll leave it there. I hope that's an adequate response at this stage. We're really looking forward to the Q&A as well.
Jonathan, thank you so much. That's brilliant. And I think what you've demonstrated there again is the really multifaceted approach we have here that we need to have to addressing these issues. We're going to move on now, and we're going to get a journalist view now from Simone Kyriakou, who is Senior Editor at FT Advisor. Simone is an award-winning financial journalist with more than 20 years experience under her belt, and is well placed again to give us her views on this report. So over to you, Simone.
And thank you very much, Jackie, and thank you, Sophia and Jonathan for going through the report for us and for outlining stuff. As a journalist, I've got to say, Jonathan, it's always encouraging when we hear government ministers understanding all the nuances of pensions legislation, because the fate of we Gen Xers is in your hands, as it were. But it's really encouraging. So thank you very much for highlighting some of these issues of fairness. I think for me, the report shows very clearly the huge differentials between the older cohort who are approaching retirement right now and the pressing issues affecting them, and the younger cohort who perhaps have different problems that face them, but maybe have a little bit more time to make these up. I will say I perhaps still just about fall into the younger cohort. From my perspective, it's very unusual to be reading a report where I can look down at and say, that relates to me, that relates to me, that relates to me. It's shocking, but it's also comforting in many ways. Quite often as a journalist, I'll receive a report on pensions and I'll think, well, this has no relation, this bears no relation to me. Some of the big issues that I think really need to be tackled are carers and lower earners, or people who are earning just sort of outside of the limit because they're working 2 or 3 jobs to kind of make ends meet. Maybe they're the only breadwinner in the house. We really need to do more, and I think the policy proposals that you've come up with are really helpful and really useful. I think we do have to look at carers particularly. I say this as a woman because I know that generally the women tend to be the ones who have caring responsibilities later in life, or for their elderly parents, or for their young children. You know, I happen to fall into that cohort where my parents are in their mid to late 80s, and I've got a very, very young child. So on either end of the spectrum, I find myself being that sort of squeezed middle. And I think some of the proposals are brilliant. You know, allowing individuals to share their annual allowance for pension contributions with another person who perhaps can't earn or can't contribute because they are caring or because they're in poor health. I think that would be a wonderful and equitable proposal, and it's something that the government could feasibly take into consideration. I mean, if you think about all the women who have given up work for a portion of time and haven't paid back their NI cons, that would be an amazing thing if their partner was able to give them part of their annual allowance. Bear in mind, not everyone does pay, you know, not everyone pays the full annual allowance every year into their pension. So things like that are great. The pension sidecar that we've talked about, it's been trialed, has been trialed by Nest, I think, since 2018. This would be a great idea, perhaps, if the self-employed could be auto-enrolled into a sort of sidecar savings scheme. You know, I think Jonathan mentioned his ISA savings. Just trying to encourage people as well to build up pension pots that maybe they aren't the traditional workplace-based pension scheme, but maybe help people to think about other savings and other savings mechanisms. And another thing that I think was a standout from the report, which I think is viable just for whether it's an older member of the Gen X cohort or a younger member, is being able to have maybe age-related or pay rise-related increases to the contributions that you're able to pay. I know from personal experience, 5 years ago, I was speaking at a conference, and I happened to mention, just in the nature of the course of things, that, you know, what my pension level was. And a financial advisor came out afterwards and he had a go at me. You should be ashamed. That's all you're able to save. Why haven't you saved more? And before I was even able to say to him, do you understand how little journalists actually get paid, and how little we're allowed to contribute beyond a certain barrier? He'd sort of wandered off. Now, he did actually come back and apologize to me later. But that idea of, well, I'm saving as much as I can into my DC, but even though we have a very generous employer at the FT, you still have these bands, you know, well, you know, you can't pay in more than 6% yourself until you're 45. Well, why not do it when there's a pay rise? Why isn't that given as an option for you to maybe even be auto escalated? And then if we look at auto enrollment pensions, the fact that the cap is 8%, why not allow people to pay more if they're earning more? Auto escalate that, give them the option to do that. Because the more we can save from a younger age, the more hope we have of being able to shore up a decent pension in retirement. And these are all extremely important and very simple, practical policy objectives that could be put in place without hurting anyone. And I don't see why employers and the government and legislators can't actually get together in a room and say, you know, we could do this, let's try, let's see how it goes, and actually improve people's lives. I was just talking today to someone that the 2012 was when auto enrollment was implemented. It was one of the best policy decisions that any government has done in years. I mean, if you think about the best policy decisions, I mean, short of the NHS, when was it, sort of 1947, what else has come into being that has actually really benefited millions of people? But we need to do more. It's a great step. It's a brilliant starting level, but we need to do more. And I think, you know, if policymakers, if legislators do not pay attention to the ILC's report and actually start implementing some of these very small but very worthwhile tweaks, people like myself and, you know, in the older cohort of Gen Xers are in for a really shocking time in retirement. This is just my my personal perspective, you know, based on my readings and talking to other people, but I'm sure we can go into a bit more detail in the questions. I won't take up any more time now.
Thanks, Simone, and great to get some views of some Gen Xers in this, as well as broader policy views. We're going to move on now to someone who I suspect may also be a Gen Xer. Chris Curry, well known to many of you on the call, on the webinar, I'm sure. Chris is director of the Pensions Policy Institute, has been involved in almost every angle of pension reforms and changes over the last 20 years, Chris, maybe not quite that much. And of course, Chris is also recently appointed as principal of the Pension Dashboard Programme at the Money and Pension Service, alongside his role at the PPI. So he has a busy time of it. So we're even more grateful, I think, to have him on the session today. So Chris, over to you for your thoughts on Gen Xers and the challenges they face for planning their retirement.
Thanks very much, Jackie. Yes, I should declare that I am also part of Gen X, although I think slightly more into the middle of it than either of the other panelists that we've had so far. I need to declare that interest. And yes, this year is also the 20th anniversary of the Pensions Policy Institute, hard though it is to believe. And I spent a lot of time before my time at the PPI looking at pensions as well. So I've stopped counting how many years we've been involved in this. I just want to start off by offering my congratulations both to the ILC and to Phoenix. Incredibly useful and informative piece of work, and a very good presentation from Sophia. So thank you very much for that, and delighted to see this work building on, I think, as Andy mentioned in his introduction, the work that the PPI did around Generation Vexed. I think the way that this has expanded on that and gone into the attitudes and primary research, but also into the policy recommendations, has made it a kind of very powerful piece overall. So congratulations all round. I was going to comment a little bit about some of the policy recommendations, I think, and some of the issues that come out of that. One of the things that I've also been involved in over the years is automatic enrolment, and I would echo a lot of Simone's thoughts about the success of automatic enrolment, but also Jonathan's point that no one really thinks that where we are is the final point. And the 2017 automatic enrolment review examined quite a lot of these issues in a fair amount of detail, and it's good to see that some of the recommendations made then are still as valid now as they were at the point. And so I think there is a real desire, I think, to see contributions through automatic enrolment increase. I think what we have found is that there's probably no one single way of doing that will provide all of the answers. And I think, therefore, a combination approach and some of the options which the RC have put forward here certainly come into that banner. Auto-escalation is a very interesting idea and is one that has been considered. Of course, it's worth bearing in mind that auto-escalation is already possible at the employer level, so employers can choose to offer an auto-escalation scheme. It may be that the government might want to be thinking about how they can encourage that to happen. I think the difficulties of doing it on a national basis are really that the research shows that it works best where there is engagement with individuals before it's introduced. And I think especially when we're talking about building on top of the size of contributions we currently have, we need to be careful that there is some kind of safety net, a bit like the opt-down option, if people want to stick at the current contribution levels rather than opting out completely, to make sure that we don't end up losing people when we're trying to gain contributions going into the system, which is an important one. I think the sidecar savings element is something which goes hand in hand in a way with auto-escalation. If we're thinking about the financial resilience of people in Generation X, and I think the pandemic has brought that more into focus than at any other time, where people need pension saving, but also other forms of saving. And we've seen the affordability issues that people in this generation and other generations are facing, and actually having a mixture of long-term and maybe shorter-term accessible savings is very helpful. But it's important that that's built on top of the current minimum and not eating into the minimum that's currently there for longer-term pension savings. So I think that has to be part of the options which are looked at going forward. And I was also very pleased to hear Jonathan talking about how this all relates into the state pension and the triple lock, because obviously that is a very important part of this. For many people in Generation X, a large part of their retirement income will come from the state pension. And so what happens to the state pension over the next 10, 15, 20 years between now and then also has a real direct impact on how much they need to save between now and then. And so it's important that I think we come to some kind of consensus on the future of the state pension. I think there is reaching a consensus that the triple lock is not something that's sustainable over the very long term. I don't think it was ever intended to be sustainable over the very long term. But what's important is trying to determine what exactly it is that replaces the triple lock, and what is it that the state pension is there to do and to achieve. So maybe start thinking about what's the right level long term for the state pension, rather than what's the right indexation for the state pension in the short term, is an important part of where we need to go. There are a number of other aspects I think touched on in the report. I really have to, I think, at least metaphorically change hats here at this point to talk about pensions dashboards. Very pleased to see the recognition in the report of the importance of dashboards going forward, of which of course I have to agree with. They are going to be a very important part of the future going forward. From 2023 onwards, we're expecting dashboards to be available, but they're not as a solution in themselves. And I think the report is absolutely right to highlight that the information provided by the dashboards needs to be used alongside other sources of information and potentially other modelling tools, as well as engagement and capability to allow people to make the best. So although we're spending a lot of time talking about automatic enrolment here, actually it's how you engage with people on top of automatic enrolment that is also going to be vital going forward, and pensions dashboards are an important part of that. I think finally, the one other point I was going to make is that all of the policies here that we're talking about for Generation X, I think, are equally applicable to every generation that follows on behind Generation X. I think the key thing is that there is less time for Generation X to make up the gaps that currently exist in the system, and which are existing because of systems changing over time from one to another. So that does mean there is some time sensitivity in this, as Sophia was pointing out very clearly at the end of the presentation. But I think it means that while we're looking at solutions for Generation X, we need to think beyond Generation X in trying to determine what is the right outcomes and what are the right policy measures to put in place for now. It needs to address some of the problems that we've highlighted, but they also need to be there and sustainable for the long term, and to help address some of the other issues which have been identified throughout both the report and the contributions that we've had from the panelists, which look at things like equality between the genders, which look at the issues that we have with ethnic minority groups, which look at some of the issues with people with disabilities, maybe trying to work out how we best make that link or break the link potentially even between the labour market and retirement outcomes that we're seeing at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. A lot more food for thought. Right, I can see that we've had quite a few questions, so I'm going to come to those in a moment. But just a quick reminder before I do so that if you're using social media to comment on this report or this webinar, then please use the @ILC UK handle and the hashtag Generation X. So let's turn to the questions. I can see from quite a few of the comments that we've got quite a few baby boomers in the audience who are expressing some views on the experience of the baby boomers in relation to retirement planning, and I think some useful comments that the baby boomers generation was not one generation. It was not homogenous, and it's certainly not true that everyone in that group had DB pensions or even workplace pensions, and so in many ways missed out even more on automatic enrolment. And then in the same way as Sophia explained, the Gen Xers are not a homogenous group, and we have a group of them who clearly still do benefit from DB pensions, rather a lot of them actually, albeit that those DB pensions are not as generous. So moving to some of the questions and statements that we've got in the Q&A, I think one of the sort of groups of questions that we've got are around prioritisation, and whether the panel feel that there are particular priorities that should be given over to helping solve issues for Gen Xers in particular, but also for generations that follow. I'd like to ask each of the panelists actually their thoughts on what the priorities are here. Is it more important to help people with jobs and their working lives and continuing their working lives for longer? Or is it about fixing pensions? Is it about, particularly for the younger Gen Xers, the housing market? Or is it more about a rounded approach to helping them with their financial planning, with advice and guidance and maybe signposting? So do you have a view on solving some of those intractable problems, and which you feel is the priority for this group, and maybe also which is most practical to solve for this group? Jonathan, I don't know whether you want to start with that thorny question.
Yeah, Jackie, thank you. That is a big question, but I think it's at the heart of what we're talking about. I mean, I would say, I think the way I see it is you see in the success of auto enrolment, a big success in terms of coverage. And actually the question, I think this is what the report directly relates to, it is now about adequacy, about making sure people have the information and the opportunity and the vehicles to be putting aside the adequate level of savings. I mean, I don't think when it comes to people's working lives, I think people are already working a pretty substantial working life, and I think it's always important to say there are still in the UK very big disparities in life expectancy depending on what kind of work you've done. I mean, life expectancy for people in more physical manual occupations is nothing like the progress we've seen for other people, and indeed different parts of the country have seen very different rates of longevity. So these issues all have to be factored in, but I want people to have a whole phase of life in retirement with all the joys that brings, but also, if we're being honest, a lot of people rely on grandparents for their childcare. This is an integral part of how the economy works. And I think, when I look at my own family and I look at the differences that have happened generation to generation, it is, my dad was a fireman, so a difficult job, but a good pension scheme. And he has had a wonderful retirement. I think he wouldn't mind me saying that, and it's something that previous generations haven't had. And I just think this is a positive story that we've got to focus on. I don't think it's flexibility in retirement age for people who want to work longer and things, I think is broadly there. And in terms of the returns people get because of how national insurance works, there are already incentives to do that. But I think it's about in people's working lives, getting them saving more and saving younger, and understanding how that links to the kind of retirement that they want, and the components of the system being long-term, and a sense that I'm self-aware enough as a politician to know that people often worry that governments will change the goalposts once systems have been introduced. I think we've got to have some certainty in that as well, so people can make those adequate decisions. But I think that's how I see it. This question now, central to it, is how can we work the sector, with industry, with businesses, with individuals, to produce that longer term framework for adequacy in what people are putting aside. And I think that these questions in the report around using people's uprating of salaries and things, as Simone said, and how that can be made as burden free as possible, that's all really interesting. But I think that's got to be part of it. Let's just make sure that changes we are proposing will be adequate to the task ahead of us, because it's clearly a big challenge.
Thanks, Jonathan. Simone, do you want to come in at all there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to make this question of priorities, because of course every single individual is an individual, and every financial advisor I've ever spoken to, and that anyone here will ever speak to, will say that everyone's circumstances are different. I think the housing market in a way is a red herring, because the housing market is operating in a strange environment at the moment. With even now there's a housing price boom, and people are buying and selling at an alarming rate. So let's leave the housing question aside, and let's focus on pensions and retirement. I think the majority of people will want to be comfortable in retirement, but if you look online at the information that's out there, everyone tells you that there's a different level of comfortable. So before I went on this call, I looked on 4 different do-it-yourself pension providers' websites, and the government's and the Money and Pension Services website. I had a look at all the different calculators that are available, and The only one that was impartial sort of presented a more accurate picture of what I might expect to get and what my shortfall might be had I, if this is my desired income in retirement. All the others, from the do-it-yourself pension and savings and investment providers, are presenting a much higher level of income. They say, oh, to achieve at least a minimum standard of living in retirement, you will need at least 35k, or people say you'll need at least 38k. Now, to the majority of people in this country, that is more than their average salary. Do they really expect to be living on 38k in retirement? It makes no assumption for any other savings people might have. It makes no assumption for whether people are married or whether they got a spouse's income or any inheritance or any properties. But it's already presenting a barrier, saying, well, actually, in order to do that, you're going to need to have a pension of at least £250,000. That's your bare minimum pension pot you've got to save. And for someone who's on the lowest earnings level, that seems so unattainable that that could present a barrier. So let's actually make better signposting to impartial and fair and reasonable and non-sensationalist websites that are available to help people really gauge what they can expect to pay in retirement. If you expect to be mortgage free, or if you expect to rent, this is roughly how much you expect to pay in retirement, or this is how much roughly your costs will be. This is what a minimum standard in retirement will get you. And the ILC has actually helpfully provided that. But many companies don't provide that. They'll immediately pick the highest number because they think, oh no, people are going to get so scared, they'll have to buy into our services. And that's unfair. That's creating false levels of expectation and creating a sense of fear. And when people are afraid, you either make knee-jerk financial decisions that are not in your best interests, as we've seen with the awful situation with the poor British Steel pensioners, or people are so afraid they switch off. So let's create better signposting on all providers' websites to independent and unbiased, helpful and informative calculators that take everything into account, and better signposting as well in the press, that includes me, to things like this. Because if we don't prioritize getting the information right, then people won't even go and get the advice they need. People won't even start on their savings journey. So let's make it clear, let's be transparent, let's be open, and let's not be sensationalist. We've got to encourage people. And you basically, you trap more bears with honey, don't you? So let's go trap the bears with honey.
That's great. Thanks for that, Simone. And it's just astonishing to think that that platform should think 38,000 is an income to aspire for most people. There's the reality check needed there, certainly. Chris, did you want to come in at all at this point? And yeah, Andy, I'll perhaps give you a chance to respond to some of those things in a moment.
Okay, a couple of points on that, and very, very well made, Simone. I think as I work part-time for the Money and Pension Service, I'd highly recommend them as an independent source of information. But also there is a cross-industry attempt to get something which is seen. So the Pensions and Lifetime Saving Association and their retirement living standards are trying, I think, to come up with an evidence base around what people might need to live on in retirement. And I think the more we get that evidence in, rather than, as you say, marketing, I think the much better it's going to be. And that's something we will be looking at in the context of the dashboard, the pensions dashboards and the policy surrounding pensions dashboards and how that information is used. But going back to the original question and priorities, again, as you said, there's such diversity within Generation X that it's very hard for there to be a priority that will be the most help to this group. It has to be a combination of all of these different things. I think at the moment, anything to do with the labour market is going to be incredibly difficult, just because we are still in this situation where at some point furlough will end. Who knows what will happen to the labour market at that point? And so I think that a lot of that is going to be dealing with short-term issues and making sure that there is some restructuring and making sure, I think it's important that Generation X doesn't miss out as part of that. Could be quite important, in the same way you don't want any generations to miss out in that. So that's going to be very difficult for whoever is left with that. Pensions, I think the development of automatic enrolment is already overdue. If I'm being honest, as I said, the recommendations were made back in 2017. one thing we do know about pensions is it takes a long time for policy, even when it's enacted, to come into place. So if we think about automatic enrolment, it was only 2019 that we finally got to the final minimum level of contribution of 8% of band earnings. The recommendations to start introducing automatic enrolment were made, I think, the back end of 2005. So you can see that it takes a long time for pension policy, even when it's decided and agreed on a consensus basis, to actually come into effect. So I think it really is important that we start thinking and legislating for this now, in order for it to be able to come in 5-6 years' time, which is still going to be too late for some people in Generation X, but at least will give some of the younger part of the generation a chance to benefit from it before they get into that retirement phase.
Thanks, Chris. Andy, did you want to come in at all on any of those points?
Yes, thanks, Jackie. I pretty much agree with the rest of the panel members and what they said. I think my sense of it would be to find a way of engaging. I think, as Simone said, you have to think about individual circumstances. Everyone will have their own individual circumstances. So from an industry perspective, from a regulator perspective, from a policymaker perspective, it's kind of thinking about how do we help everyone understand their circumstances? What do they need? Do they need further education or information? How do we speak and communicate to the Generation Xer? So thinking about, I'm very conscious of it. I started the industry over 30 years ago. I am a Generation Xer myself, but I only just made it on the earlier cut, as opposed to Jonathan making it the later cut. And it's something of a frustration of mine that we tend to speak in jargon in the industry, and the jargon is built upon probably legislation and the like. And by and large, people find it either dull or confusing or a bit of a switch off. So how do we find a way of engaging with people so they can understand where they are and what they need to do and what action they need to take in order to address their own kind of ambitions or individual circumstances, is kind of where I would focus, I think.
Okay, thanks, Andy. One of the things that struck me as we were discussing this was that one of the barriers does seem to be, and I think Sophia referred to it, does seem to be people's understanding of what they can and can't do with their pensions, and particularly how much they can contribute and how they go about doing that. And I wonder whether there's anyone who has any thoughts on whether government, whether employers, whether providers do enough to help people understand how much they can contribute to their pensions, and how they might go about contributing more than the default level of 5% or total of 8%. Does anyone want to pick that up? Chris, you happy to do that?
I can come in on that because it's a really important point, I think, and I think it's one of the areas where automatic enrolment needs building on, because I think if you think back, and Andy will probably remember if he's been in pensions nearly as long as I have, that kind of in the early 2000s there was a lot of effort to try and get people to understand their pensions a bit better. Before automatic enrolment came in, there was a lot about if you give people much better pensions information, then they'll make the right decision. Stakeholder pensions was based around the idea of if you make a low cost, accessible pension available and tell people about it, they'll start saving. And we know that didn't happen, and that has never really happened in the UK. We've never had a situation where individuals have voluntarily saved lots of money for their retirement, unless they happen to be in a certain wealth cohort. Generally, it's either been organised by the employer on your behalf, or more recently through automatic enrolment, it's still the employer doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but it's a choice that's made for you that you have to opt out of, rather than something that people actively choose to do. So we've never really been able to crack this conundrum of how do we get people to save more. We're in a much better position now that automatic enrolment exists, because they're part of the way there. We've just got to get them to save a little bit more rather than trying to get them to save a lot more. But there does need to be, I think, a whole series of policy and policy thinking around this. Pensions dashboard, again, is part of it. I think if people can find pensions dashboards where they would normally be looking at any financial information and see the value of their pensions, then hopefully that will generate that spark of interest, which will lead to a bit more engagement. But if that's the case, then we need the places for them to go that has this impartial information that helps them understand that although automatic enrolment is a really good starting point and a really good base, it's only going to give them a relatively basic level of income in retirement on top of the state. And if they want to be able to do more, then they need to be doing more now as part of that. I think automatic enrolment can lead to that. And I think over time it will generate that interest. People will, when they start to think about pensions, historically, people start to think about it in their 40s, 50s. So those just probably coming into the bottom end of Generation X now. And in the future, when they do that, they'll have some pension saving there rather than coming into it as many Generation Xers did and not having any pension saving there. So I think that gives us a better base to work on, but we still need to work hard, I think, to get people to take that voluntary action. I don't think there's much appetite in the UK for a compulsory saving system that gets everybody saving a certain amount. And while it's voluntary, even though there's kind of soft compulsion through automatic enrolment, there needs to be that engagement to help people kind of do that flexibility, to do that specialization, I think, to get it to fit themselves, almost a kind of tailored solution, which is individual. People need to have that little bit of engagement to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to come in on Jonathan?
Jackie, if I could just say a few things. I mean, I really agree with Chris there on these points around understanding. I don't think you can just pin it on employers. Excuse me. I think, there's a much wider societal conversation that is required. I mean, I tell this anecdote a few times. I remember once talking to a senior, very senior figure in the city working for one of the major pension providers, and I said, to be honest, I really struggle sometimes to even get my own family to be as interested as I think they should. He said to me, I struggle to get the people who work on pensions for me to think about this in the way that's adequate for them. And I think there is something in that. I was really struck. We're obviously all MPs this week preparing very much for the budget tomorrow. There was a story about speculating about the lifetime allowance in one of the major broadsheet newspapers a few days ago. You're saying Chancellor to hit pensioners, and of course it's the lifetime allowance. So it's not about hitting pensioners, it's about hitting people who are saving for their pensions. And it's just one example. I mean, we have some of the leading, I think, pensions journalists in this country as well. So it is a balance, but that understanding has to be there. I'm surprised when I talk to constituents sometimes how even you have to sell them the premise of a pension, about why that is the right thing to be looking at, rather than, say, looking to property and housing equity as a solution for their retirement. So there is a big job to do. I mean, I would like, sometimes you watch American dramas and they will use the American savings code legislation. It's a popular reference, a cultural reference that people know. I'm not saying we can get pensions to that degree in the UK, but I think we've got to acknowledge this is a significant issue. It is more than just employers. It's about how we talk about retirement and pensions in the UK. We've all got a responsibility to play. It's certainly not easy, but I mean, that is quite genuine. I think the challenge of getting these messages out, we've all got to be thinking about how we can do that.
That's great. Simone, did you want to come in at all?
Yeah, I'd love to say, can we just please stop saying that pensions is boring or pensions is impenetrable? I mean, when we talk about that in the industry, we're almost apologizing, saying, well, we know it's complicated, and you hold your hands up, and that automatically presents a barrier. When young people get their first payslip, they're so excited, they're talking about it to everyone. We need to get that same level of excitement and engagement. And I cannot wait for the pensions dashboard, because humans are visual. We know this, a picture tells 1,000 words. When you see your cash flow model right in front of you on your dashboard, when you see how much money is going in, you get engaged. That's why savings apps like GoHenry are so exciting for young people, because they can see how much money is building up. So let's get more transparent. Let's get more excited. Let's talk about pensions as something exciting. This isn't a pension. This is all the money you're going to have to spend in retirement doing the things that you really want to do. Then you'll have the time to do them. So this is your income in retirement. This is your pay slip for retirement. Get excited about it. Get visual with it. Get some really good cash flow modeling. Get pictures that people can have snapshots available, sent to their phones, so they know what to do and how much to get. Let's stop being apologetic about pensions being complicated and just start referring to it in ways that people can understand.
Yeah, Jackie, can I come in there?
Sure.
I mean, just to say, I agree with that. It's really important that we do bounce off things like the dashboard, which will help. Digital innovation will help people sort of follow how they're getting on. That in itself will probably help a level of engagement that probably wasn't there before. And that in itself in society, which I think was Jonathan's point, will build up that level of interest, and it becomes more of a thing across the society as a whole, which will ultimately benefit us all as people focus on how we're getting on. Am I contributing enough? Should I be contributing more? It's quite exciting, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things that are moving potentially in our favour here, which will help. ESG and investing sustainably and things like that will be other factors which will help people also engage with pensions just as a form of savings. And that's how we should think about it.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to pick a couple of what I think are philosophical questions, or more philosophical questions, from the Q&A list. So we've got a couple of people asking about whether we're trying to do too much with private pensions, and whether there's a role for the state to do more. I know, Chris, you talked about the importance of the state pension and where that was going for this group, as well as other age groups. So that's one question. And then another question we have is about the interaction between debt and saving for a pension. Is it better? Should we be encouraging individuals to put more money into their pensions rather than focusing on paying off their debts? Are they too troubled by paying off what are in effect quite low-cost debts, and they should be leveraging their finances through putting the money into a pension? So a couple of questions there. I don't know who wants to pick up first on those two challenges. Jonathan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, some really good questions in the Q&A that address some of the more kind of philosophical questions about how the system should operate. I mean, on the question of the state and public-private provision, Jackie, I mean, I think if you look at the reforms with the single-tier state pension, I think the sort of the philosophical premise is broadly right, which is, you have a solid foundation of state provision. As Chris says, it's not put forward as sufficient for everyone to retire on, but the idea is that's the foundation stone, and then you build around a system of auto enrolment to get that coverage, then have these questions of adequacy. I actually think the relationship between those things is right. I mean, if you look at, for instance, pension credit in policy terms, take up a pension credit, low levels of take up is a really big issue, and actually perhaps a system where that becomes a residual benefit because you've got a decent state foundation that you build upon, I actually quite like as a system, and prevents pensioner poverty, but is clear and understandable, and you can do that. But that conversation is linked to the point around debt and savings. I mean, what we need is for people to understand what their financial behavior today will mean for the kind of retirement that they expect. And none of us, without knowing the individual circumstances that people might have, could give an answer on that. I mean, the levels of personal household debt in the UK, I think, should be of concern to people. If you look at what's happened in the crisis, you see, obviously the headline figure is that savings have gone up considerably, but actually what you get when you dig into that information is this incredible inequality between people who've been on full pay, working from home, had less outgoings, had certainly less travel outgoings and lunchtime bills and things like that, and they've been able to save money, pay down debt. At the other end of the spectrum, there's people who've already been in insecure position who are in a much worse position now. They've effectively relied on short-term debt to get through the crisis. And I think actually, we'll hear a lot tomorrow, I think, in the budget about V-shaped recoveries, because we always do. If you look at all of the international analysis, the concern is of a K-shaped recovery. So people who are in a really difficult position, having that inequality compounded going forward, whilst people who've been on a solid platform can then bounce back quite quickly. So that's what really worries me. I think if we're looking at how low-cost advice technology could help people make decisions, I do think some analysis of, for instance, what it would mean in terms of the mortgage you've got to pay down some of that and not have that interest compound versus what that might mean to put that into your pension scheme. Obviously, it depends on your financial circumstances, but I think there are ways we can signpost people to that. a lot of people approach personal debt from the issue of their outgoings rather than the overall level of interest that they're paying on that, and we've got to understand that as well. So I think, you know, we've got to factor in human behavior to that and what we know. But generally, it's all about how can we increase people's awareness in a way which they'll be interested in, is accessible, is enough to make some pretty solid decisions about. That's at the core of it, definitely. And that relationship to debt, I think, has to be part of it. But we've got to be aware it'll be very different for different people.
Sorry, Jackie, you are still muted there, so I'll jump
Sorry,
in.
yes.
If we can't
Thanks, Chris.
what are you doing?
Lip reading.
If I could lip read, I think you're asking if anyone else wanted any final thoughts. No, I'll just say, just to pick up on the point about the kind of the balance between the state and the private side. It's always a trade-off, as with everything within pensions, and there's kind of three main sources of income for people as they get towards their later life. There is what they get from the state, there is what they have managed to save from their own resources, which might come through pensions, it might come through other savings, it might come through housing, and then there's if they continue to work. And I think for every individual, there'll be a different balance of those three things. And I think what we need to make sure is that there's the right balance, that there's enough of everything there to fit the different profiles of the different types of individuals that go through. We don't want to weight it too far one way or another. And I think a mixture, the sort of approach we generally tend to take in the UK, is probably not bad. There's always fine tuning you can do, but I think having a mixed economy when it comes to retirement is probably very sensible.
Great, thanks for interpreting, Chris, what I wanted. So I think I now need to wind up now. So thanks to everyone for joining in today. So that concludes our session. I think a big thank you to Sophia again for taking us through a really comprehensive piece of work that leaves us, I think, with the strong sense that there's a significant proportion of Gen Xers who are struggling to prepare adequately for retirement. And while many have undoubtedly benefited from workplace pensions both before and after automatic enrolment, there are significant barriers for some due to a really complicated mix of circumstances, whether it's difficult personal circumstances, difficult economic conditions during the years that for many should have been the years where they peaked in terms of earnings, and difficulties created by policy initiatives that haven't fully allowed them or easily allowed them to participate in workplace pensions or other methods of saving. And we have a whole layer of other things going on around advice, guidance, engagement, and so on. But it's in no one's interest for large groups of any generation to approach and enter retirement with inadequate savings. So solving the problems will be far from easy, particularly in this difficult economic environment that we're all going to face over the next few years. But as Sophia and our speakers have suggested, there are policy solutions that may help. They're not going to be easy. But I'm sure the debate will go on for some time, and I know that ILC are keen for the debate to continue, and we'd welcome your input through social media or through direct contact with ILC. So I'd just like to close by thanking all of our speakers today. That's been great, and everyone's contributed massively, and everyone else who's joined us on the launch. And thanks also to Phoenix Group for their support for this project. The report is available on the website, along with the slides and the recording of the launch. For news of ILC's latest webinars and to stay up to date with all ILC news, please visit their website at ilcuk.org.uk, join the mailing list, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at ILC UK. Thank you again, and stay safe, everyone. And we hope to welcome you to another webinar or event soon. And I believe the next one is up on the screen. So please join the next ILC webinar, Making the Extra Years Count, Inequalities in Disability and Dependency with Increasing Longevity. Another fascinating subject, as ever, from ILC. So thank you again, and stay safe, everyone. Goodbye.